Okay. So how can we escape the authority dilemma? It seems to me we can escape it if we use epistemic considerations in a negative fashion to delineate the scope for democratic decision-making as arising when there is no third personal epistemic authority on any particular issue. Right? So we get a negative defense of democracy. Democracy is at least potentially appropriate when there is no third personal epistemic authority, when there is no expertise. I've only accused you. Okay, let me first say something about procedural value as opposed to instrumental value. Deliberative decision-making has instrumental epistemic value if it leads to more accurate beliefs among the participants and or to more accurate decisions. It has instrumental disvalue if deliberation leads to less accurate beliefs among the participants and or to less accurate decision. And there's quite a few studies which show that in some contexts deliberation can do that. Right? It potentially has instrumental disvalue. In my understanding, deliberative democratic decision-making has procedural epistemic value if its epistemic value does not reduce to the epistemic value of the outcome. I'm going to primarily focus on the procedural epistemic value thus understood in contrast to instrumental value of the deliberative process, not decision-making as such. So, by contrasting procedural value with its instrumental value, the way I understand procedural value is such that it is possible for a procedural to have epistemic value even if its outcome is less accurate. Like if the beliefs that the participants hold are less accurate as a result. That may sound paradoxical, but I want to show that this is possible and indeed part of an epistemic defense of democracy, the right way of thinking about democracy. There are different ways in which we can think about procedural value, and I follow Rawls here with his tripartite distinction between pure, perfect, and imperfect proceduralism. With pure proceduralism, the procedure is necessary and sufficient for the value of its outcome. That's not the way I'm thinking about the procedural value in the epistemic case. So that leaves us with perfect or imperfect proceduralism. So here there is a procedure-independent standard, so the procedure is not sufficient, but it may be necessary either to produce the ideal outcome as identified by the procedure-independent standard, or at least to approximate it. The latter is the case of imperfect proceduralism. And it's in this second sense, in the sense of imperfect proceduralism, that I think about the procedural epistemic value of deliberation. So in that interpretation of procedural epistemic value, accuracy of beliefs remains the intrinsic epistemic value and sets a procedure-independent standard for evaluating deliberation. But what distinguishes imperfect proceduralism from instrumentalism about epistemic value is that the latter captures a situation in which the procedure has value because there is no procedure-independent access to accuracy. Sorry, I should have been the former. So, with imperfect epistemic proceduralism, we defend the value of the procedure on grounds that there is no procedure-independent access to accuracy, so the procedure is a proxy to making correct decisions. And the important feature of thinking about epistemic value in proceduralist terms is that the epistemic value of the deliberative procedure does not reduce to the epistemic value of its outcome. Right? That's the proceduralist core that I want to retain. That decision-making procedures may have procedural value is, of course, a thought that's familiar from the practical context. Right? We get it from Rawls, we get it from Charles Lamore as well when he talks about equal respect, and we get it from Stephen Dall when he talks about mutual accountability. These are all instances of affirming procedural value in the practical context. the case I want to build is that we can think about proceduralism in the epistemic context as well. And I want to make the case for that by focusing on the epistemology of disagreement. I think that's where I think we can show the possibility of procedural epistemic values in a way that's significant for the defense of democracy. There are, of course, all sorts of disagreements. So there are disagreements which are the result of one party simply making a mistake or having failed or being unwilling to consider the relevant evidence and so on. But I'm going to focus on a different kind of disagreement. One in which deliberation fails to reveal evidence that one party has left unexamined, or that fails to demonstrate that one party has simply made a mistake. In addition, I want to focus on the case of disagreement that arises between parties that consider each other to be epistemic peers. By an epistemic peer, I mean something quite weak, namely someone you take to be equally likely to make a mistake. So that's an all things considered criterion, nothing to do with formal qualifications or equal cognitive abilities and so forth. So on this definition of peers, deliberation among parties who consider each other peers can occur not just in the context of academic or expert inquiry, but in any small or large social collective, for example, on issues which are too wide-ranging and complex for anyone to count as an expert, or when relevant information is dispersed across all the different parties. What's interesting about this case of disagreement is that the parties, under certain circumstances at least, the parties to the deliberation each have reason to adjust their beliefs in direction of the other. Okay? So if the thought is if at the beginning of deliberation one asserts P and the other not P, and they find themselves in the relevant circumstances of disagreement, they each have reason to diminish confidence in their original beliefs. Before I go into any more details here on this epistemology of peer disagreement, I want to address an objection, which is that this is completely the wrong starting point for understanding and evaluating democratic decision-making procedures, because, after all, in a democratic collective, there are massive epistemic inequalities. So starting with peer disagreement is a wrong starting point. So let me first reply to this objection and then move on in my case for the procedural epistemic value of deliberation. So in reply to this objection, I first want to concede that yes, of course, right, there are massive epistemic inequalities, many of them perfectly justified. And of course, I would say that's part of the reason why in many contexts we don't rely on democratic decision-making, but we leave the decision to those who do know. Right? So my first reply to the objection is yes, of course, right? There are massive inequalities and they're often justified. But what I'm interested in is in the question, as I said at the beginning, when is deliberative democracy potentially justified, right? And my point is precisely, it's not necessarily in this case where there are justified epistemic inequalities such that there is legitimate epistemic authority. We must carve out a different space here for democracy. Okay. Second point is the notion of peerhood that I'm using is compatible with all sorts of inequalities. It is domain specific. So two individuals might consider themselves as peer on one set of issues while acknowledging that on the whole rest of issues they are epistemic unequals. The final point I want to make in defense of using the epistemology of peer disagreement as a starting point is that while I've defined a peer as someone who is equally likely to make a mistake in a particular situation, that is not to say that two peers necessarily always perform equally well. So, and when you have information that someone you examine consider to be a peer is not performing well, right, didn't deliberate properly, came up as a result that's so wildly off the mark, right? Then you are entitled to discount you, even though you would, in other circumstances, hold them a peer. So that's my third point in defense. So basically what I'm trying to say that I don't mean my claim that we should start with the epistemology of peer disagreement in any strong way. It may still be too strong, and it may still be possible to weaken it. Namely, I'm now arguing from a case where there's symmetric credibility, or at least a case for symmetric credibility. And my story will probably go through, in all cases where there is at least some case for lending credibility to the belief of the other, even if the situation isn't symmetrical. But I haven't thought this through fully. I'm here following the literature on the epistemology of peer disagreement, and to some extent hostage to that literature, but I think it's possible, when I have had time to think about it more carefully, to weaken my claims even more and free myself to quite a large extent from that literature by moving away from symmetry. But anyway, so the rest of my case will be using the symmetry assumption in this weak way that I've just explained. Okay. So the kind of case that I have in mind, where there is potentially a prima facie case for democratic decision-making in a deliberative fashion, is the following. So suppose there's an expert committee that prepares a policy together with the relevant politicians, MPs, whatever, so for example, on a new minimum wage policy. And suppose there's disagreement on the question whether all the evidence appropriately interpreted supports the policy or not. Will the policy significantly increase unemployment? This would speak against the policy, or will it not and have other beneficial effect? This would speak for the policy. And suppose the disagreement on this issue now isn't just between the experts, say, and the politicians, who have all sorts of other interests in mind, but among the experts themselves. Right? And suppose the disagreement we're considering here is not one of one party not able or willing to consider the relevant evidence, or one party simply having made a mistake, like say, in their calculations, refer to the plus-minus sign, or something like that. Right? The deliberation does not establish any of that. It can't establish that one party has failed to consider the relevant evidence, can't establish that one party just made an obvious mistake. Right? They just find themselves in this disagreement, one side to the debate believing, on the basis of the evidence they have, that the minimum wage policy will increase unemployment, and the other believes it will not. And suppose that this disagreement isn't limited to this expert committee, but is mirrored in society at large, is mirrored in parliament, in the media, in discussions among friends and family members. Right? So it becomes a disagreement writ large. So we can imagine then, as ourselves as participants in this deliberation, suppose you've looked at the available data and the available arguments by the experts and formed the belief that the proposed minimum wage policy will significantly increase unemployment. I've also looked at the data and the arguments and formed the belief that the policy will not significantly increase unemployment. So we're holding opposite views on whether or not we should adopt the policy. So I want to claim that in a situation like this, it is not crazy for us to consider each other as peers, and therefore to think about the kind of problems that democratic decision-making potentially faces along those lines. What is characteristic of this situation from an epistemic point of view is that each side of the disagreement deserves some weight for the claim it makes, and there's no vantage point from which the disagreement could be resolved. And so the appropriate response to this disagreement is, as I mentioned earlier, in a situation like this, is for each party to diminish confidence in their original beliefs. Different views on the epistemology of peer disagreement cash this thought out differently. So the defenders of what's called the total evidence view consider the opinion of peers as just another piece of evidence that a responsible epistemic agent needs to take into account in addition to the first order evidence they had for their beliefs. The conciliatory views, by contrast, view the opinion of a peer to be a consideration of a different kind from the first order considerations that shaped the original beliefs. But these differences don't matter here from my point, which is we have here a situation where the epistemic agents involved are mutually responsible to each other. They are accountable to each other, and they are under, or they have reason at least as good epistemic agents to adjust their beliefs in direction of each other. So I've called the other paper the accountability thesis about the epistemic value of deliberation. The thought is, we have in a situation like this a double accountability. We have the familiar accountability to truth that we get in the standard epistemic case, right? You ought to form your beliefs in a way that best tracks the truth, that aims at truth. But we also have, in addition, accountability to your epistemic peers. So it's the claim of a peer which gives you a reason to adjust your belief, and vice versa. The situation is symmetric. So this double accountability is important, especially this notion that in such situation we are accountable to peers and not just to the truth, on purely epistemic grounds. That is what I want to take here from this literature. What is more, in those circumstances, neither of us can validly claim third personal epistemic authority. What we've established is that precisely even though we originally formed a belief about what the evidence shows, the peer disagreement revealed to us that we may be wrong, and what the upshot of that is that the third personal point of view is contested and is as such out of reach. Okay, so that is my case for the possibility of a deliberative procedure having procedural epistemic value. The notion is, the thought is mutual accountability here that we get from thinking about a situation of peer disagreement is a procedural value. These epistemic agents have reason to engage in deliberation with each other and to adjust their beliefs in direction of each other, even if that actually leads to a departure from the truth. So suppose one of the two is correct, right? So let's suppose it turns out from a third personal point of view that the policy does indeed increase unemployment, right? So the one party who is adjusting their beliefs away from that, in the sense that they're diminishing their belief, their confidence in their belief that it will do so, departs from accuracy. But so that's the contra-instrumentalist point I want to emphasize. There's still value to engage in deliberation in this way, right? Because this third personal point of view is not accessible. Okay. And so now I can't go into how this solves the authority dilemma, but so my final point is just that when we are in such circumstances, and there may not be many, but my sense is there are perhaps more than we think. When we are in such circumstances, then deliberative decision-making is potentially legitimate, precisely because we have no access to a third personal perspective. There is no third personal epistemic authority about what the correct decision is. So I'm sorry, this is sort of a rudimentary sketch of the paper that I had. Thank you.